Opening the gravel road coughed a cloud of dust behind my beat-up sedan, a final, weary exhalation before it vanished into the deepening shadows of the Appalachian wilderness. 3 days of driving, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate hope, had brought me to this forgotten corner of the world. The inheritance, they'd called it. A vast estate, tucked away from any semblance of civilization, a place the mapping applications couldn't quite resolve, dissolving into green static the closer I got. My phone, long since a dead weight in my pocket, had offered no comfort for hours. My cynicism, usually a reliable shield, felt thin and worn. I'd seen enough of life's cruel jokes to expect this grand family legacy to be nothing more than a moldering shack and a mountain of debt. But the lawyer, a sharp-suited man with eyes like chipped glass, had assured me the land alone was worth a fortune. A fortune I sorely needed. I wasn't going back to scraping by, not after what I'd endured, not after those nights spent shivering in the cold, or even worse, the suffocating quiet of a prison library after hours, trying to make sense of legal texts that offered no escape. This house, this land, was my exit ramp. Sell it, liquidate it, and never look back. The trees, ancient and gnarled, finally parted to reveal it. Not a shack, not exactly. A mansion, yes, but one that seemed to have sprouted from the earth itself, an organic extension of the decay surrounding it. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the walls, clawing its way up to choke the empty window frames. The front yard was a riot of untamed wilderness, waist-high weeds, thorny bushes, and what looked like the ghostly remains of a once grand garden, now a battleground of nature's indifference. No manicured lawns here, just a green, grasping maw. A wrought iron gate, rusted into immobility, blocked the main drive. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood or forgotten copper. It clung to the back of my throat, a taste of forgotten time. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant buzz of insects and the crunch of my boots on the gravel. No birdsong, no rustle of wine through the leaves. Just an immense, watchful quiet. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like a deliberate suppression. As if the landscape itself was holding its breath. I wrestled with the gate for a moment, the iron protesting with a high-pitched shriek, before giving up. No point. I could walk. The mansion loomed, growing larger, more formidable with every step I took up the overgrown drive. I could almost hear the house breathing, a slow, melancholic sigh that vibrated through the ground. Reaching the front door, I found it a behemoth of oak, studded with tarnished brass. It was swollen in its frame, warped by decades of neglect. My shoulder against it, then my full weight, finally sent it groaning inward with a sound like a dying animal. This wasn't just an old house, it was a tomb. Inside, the gloom was absolute, relieved only by slivers of weak, late afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. My flashlight beam cut a path through the motes of dust dancing in the air, illuminating a grand foyer. Cobwebs draped like funeral shrouds from the chandelier that hung, broken and forlorn, from the ceiling. Well, hell, I muttered, my voice swallowed by the cavernous space. It echoed back at me, thin and reedy, as if the house itself was mocking my meager presence. I moved deeper, each step raising a puff of ancient dust. The floorboards groaned beneath me, a symphony of decay. To my left, a vast living room, filled with shrouded furniture that looked like sleeping giants. To my right, a dining room, equally shrouded, equally desolate. I pulled back a dusty sheet from what felt like a grand piano. The keys were yellowed, some missing, others stuck. That was when I first felt it. I turned quickly, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. Nothing. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on my skin, as if something unseen had brushed past me. I told myself it was just the house settling, the temperature differences, my imagination playing tricks. I was tired, hungry, and strung out. But then, from somewhere deep within the house, a faint sound drifted to me. Not a creak, not a groan. A sigh, perhaps, or a name. My own. The sound didn't repeat. But now, it felt different. It felt aware. The house wasn't just old and decaying, it was listening. This wasn't just a property to be sold. This place felt like it was waiting. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my worn boots, and looked up at the house. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a hulking stone beast draped in ivy, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. My inheritance. My ticket out of debt, I hoped. The front door, heavy oak scarred by time, groaned open with a protest that echoed through the cavernous foyer. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the grimy windows, illuminating a grand staircase that spiraled into shadows. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, or perhaps just rust. I tried to shake off the thought. This place had been empty for decades. My first task was to find a working light switch, a futile effort. The entire grid was dead. I fished out my phone, its flashlight beam a pathetic spear against the encroaching gloom. I spent the rest of the afternoon lugging my duffel bag and a cooler filled with lukewarm sodas up the winding stairs, past cobweb-draped portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me. That first night, I slept on a lumpy mattress in what I hoped was the least decrepit bedroom, my phone's battery slowly draining as I scrolled through news articles, trying to reconnect with the outside world. But the Wi-Fi signal was a ghost, and the cellular service was non-existent. I was truly cut off. The next morning, I started my survey. I needed to assess the damage, estimate the repairs, and figure out how quickly I could offload this monstrosity. The house was enormous, a labyrinth of forgotten rooms. Some held skeletal furniture draped in white sheets, others were completely bare, their walls peeling like sunburned skin. I noticed the first oddity while trying to pry open a stubbornly stuck window in what might have once been a parlor. I shrugged it off. Old houses had quirks. Maybe a broken pipe in the wall, or a structural anomaly. Later, as I walked down a long, dark corridor on the second floor, I heard it, a faint, drawn-out sigh, like wind whistling through a crack, but it seemed to come from within the walls. I stopped dead, listening. Nothing. My imagination, I decided, playing tricks on me in this desolate place. I was tired, stressed, and alone. That was all. But the subtle disturbances continued. A floorboard would creak behind me when I was certain I was the only one moving. A door I'd left ajar would be found fully closed moments later. I found a heavy, antique compass from a mantelpiece lying face down on the rug, as if it had been dropped, though I hadn't touched it. Each time, I'd offer a rational explanation, settling house, drafts, my own clumsiness. But a prickle of unease started to burrow under my skin. My mission to catalog the house led me to the deepest, most neglected parts of the structure. My phone flashlight barely pierced the gloom. At the bottom, a heavy, iron-bound door stood sentinel. It had no handle, only a small, rusted latch that took all my strength to slide open. The sound of metal groaning on metal was deafening in the stillness. This wasn't a basement. The room was circular, built entirely of rough-hewn stone, with a low, vaulted ceiling that pressed down like a tomb lid. Shelves, carved directly into the rock, were filled not with books, but with thick, leather-bound journals and strange, etched tablets. A single, heavy wooden table stood in the center, flanked by two stools bolted to the floor. The walls were scarred, some sections bearing crude, faded drawings that looked like ancient pictographs, geometric patterns, stick figures with outstretched arms, and what looked disturbingly like a stylized eye. There were no windows, no light source save for the weak beam of my phone. The only other feature was a single, heavy iron door on the opposite wall, much sturdier and more ornate than the one I just entered through. It had a small, barred window, like a cell. The air here was utterly still, heavy with the scent of dust, old parchment, and that same metallic tang, stronger now. I walked to the central table, my boots echoing unnaturally on the stone floor. On the table, beneath a thin layer of dust, lay an open journal. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, covered in cramped, looping script. My eyes snagged on a single word, scrawled larger than the rest, underlined multiple times with frantic energy, caretaker. And I had a terrible feeling I was about to find out. My initial cynical determination to sell the place began to curdle into something far more unsettling. I had to know what this place was, and what my ancestors had been caretakers of. I pushed through the heavy oak front door, the hinges groaning a mournful welcome, and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through grimy windows. I tried to focus on the practicalities. Survey the damage, assess the potential profit. But the house wouldn't let me. It hummed with an invisible energy, a low thrumming that resonated in my chest. I heard it first as a faint sigh, like wind through a cracked pane, but there was no breeze indoors. My head snapped around. Nothing. Just the vast, empty rooms stretching into the gloom. I lay in a borrowed bed, in a room chosen for its relatively intact ceiling, trying to rationalize it away as old pipes settling or the wind. But the wind didn't murmur my name, not quite, but something close enough to make the hairs on my arms prickle. It was like trying to catch smoke. Sleep, when it finally came, was no escape. Walls of rough-hewn stone stretched endlessly, punctuated by narrow, iron-barred openings. A low, guttural chanting reverberated through the stone, vibrating in my bones. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear, desperate, ancient, hungry. My own breath hitched in my throat, a frantic, shallow gasp. This wasn't just an old, drafty house. It was alive, and it wanted something. Or, more accurately, something in it wanted something. My determination, initially focused on selling the property, now pivoted. I needed answers. I spent the next few days systematically searching the house, not for valuables, but for clues. I tapped on walls, examined every built-in shelf, every dusty portrait. I pushed past the unease, driven by a growing certainty that the key to this place lay hidden. It was behind a faded tapestry in what I'd assumed was a storage room. A cleverly concealed door, almost invisible in the gloom, opened with a groan into a narrow, winding passage. This was no ordinary study. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves crammed with books, not the decorative kind, but heavy, leather-bound tomes, many of them crumbling, their titles faded or in an archaic script I couldn't decipher. A massive, dust-shrouded desk dominated the center, covered in stacks of yellowed papers and brittle, leather-bound journals. A place of forced confinement, of forgotten truths whispered in the dark, where the weight of untold stories pressed down on you. It was a repository of secrets, and I had just locked myself inside. My fingers trembled as I picked up the topmost journal. The cover was scarred, the leather cracked and dry. It fell open to a page filled with elegant, looping script. The offering must be made. Else, the sleeper stirs. My breath hitched. The air in the room, already heavy, seemed to press down on me, squeezing the last vestiges of rational thought from my mind. This wasn't just family history, it was a chronicle of horror. My ancestors weren't just owners, they were caretakers. And the estate wasn't just a house. It was a cage. And I, the last of my line, had just walked right into it. My ancestors weren't just owners, they were caretakers. And the estate wasn't just a house. It was a cage, a tomb, a prison. The thought solidified as I glanced around the peculiar chamber I'd stumbled into. A single, grimy window was crisscrossed with thick, rusted iron bars, admitting only a sliver of the moon's pale light. The shelves, packed with brittle, leather-bound volumes, were mostly empty, the remaining books looking like silent, condemned witnesses. It was a prison library, after hours, and I was its sole, unwilling inmate. I clutched the journal, my knuckles white against the aged leather. My eyes, burning with a frantic energy, scanned the cramped, elegant script. The entries grew more desperate, more fragmented, the ink often smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled violently. A name, or rather, a designation, began to appear with chilling regularity, the presence. Sometimes, the old one. Never capitalized, as if to deny its power, yet always imbued with an unspoken terror that bled through the page. My great-grandfather's hand had penned the most explicit warnings. He wrote of the land's ancient, festering heart, a sentient malevolence that slumbered beneath the earth, stirring periodically. He described it not as a ghost or a spirit, but as a deep, resonant hunger, a primal force that had been bound by a forgotten pact, a delicate balance maintained through generations. And then, the true horror began to unfold, the offerings. I read, my breath catching in my throat, of the tribute of flesh. Of the binding, of the cycle. My great-grandfather, a man I'd only known through sepia photographs and hushed family anecdotes, detailed the horrifying ritual his ancestors had performed. It wasn't a sacrifice in the sense of a religious rite, but a feeding, a pacification. The land demanded, and the bloodline provided. Not just any blood, but the blood of the family, or those irrevocably tied to it. The entries spoke of a chosen one, a conduit, whose essence would be given to lull the entity back into its dormancy. The language was veiled, abstract, yet the implication was sickeningly clear. Lives were taken. People were fed to whatever festered beneath the soil. A cold, clammy sweat slicked my palms. My stomach churned, threatening to revolt. I could almost taste the dust motes dancing in the meager lamplight, each one a phantom of forgotten screams. The air grew heavy, not just with the scent of mildew and decaying paper, but with something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood, or rust, or both. My ancestors weren't just superstitious country folk, they were desperate, terrified custodians of a monstrous secret. They weren't just caretakers, they were jailers and executioners, bound by a horrifying inheritance. These were not mere hauntings, they were tremors, the stirrings of a leviathan preparing to break its bonds. They were the entity's voice, its tendrils reaching out, testing the strength of its prison. And then, the final, crushing blow. An entry, dated just a few decades ago, written in a hand that was eerily familiar, my grandfather's. He spoke of the weakening of the binding, the increasing frequency of the stirrings. He wrote of the necessity of the cycle, the sacred duty of the bloodline. He will be the key. He will be the offering. My name wasn't written, but it didn't need to be. I was the last. The cynical urbanite, drawn back to this godforsaken place by the lure of easy money, by the promise of an inheritance that was, in fact, a death sentence. My bloodline wasn't just critical, it was cursed. I hadn't inherited a fortune, I'd inherited a debt, a monstrous obligation, and a date with an unseen horror. They were the old one calling, its ancient hunger sharpening, its gaze fixed firmly on me. I wasn't selling this house, I was trapped within it. The estate wasn't just a sophisticated prison, it was a sophisticated trap, and I, Cole, was its next intended sacrifice. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I was not just living in a haunted house, I was living in a cage, and the lock had just clicked shut behind me. Cole was hunched over the last journal, the cheap lamplight throwing long, dancing shadows that mimicked the skeletal branches outside the reinforced, grimy windows. The air was thick, heavy, as if the very oxygen had decided to weigh me down, to press the truth further into my bones. The words blurred on the page, not from fatigue, but from the sheer, crushing weight of their meaning. My name wasn't written, but it didn't need to be. I was the last. My bloodline wasn't just critical, it was cursed.
I hadn't inherited a fortune. I'd inherited a cage. The whispers started again, not in my ears, but inside my skull, 1,000 faint voices, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, stone floor. They weren't words I could discern, just a rising tide of sound that scraped against the inside of my cranium, a sensation like fine sand abrading my thoughts. The temperature in the room plummeted. My skin crawled. It was presence. A vast, ancient malevolence, waking up. Then came the visions. Not external images projected onto the air, but flashes behind my eyes, searing and immediate, like white-hot needles plunged directly into my optic nerve. I felt the pressure of untold millennia, a hunger so profound it threatened to swallow my very being whole, to unravel the tightly wound coil of my identity. My mind buckled, not just from fear, but from the sheer, raw force of it. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that radiated from my temples, behind my eyes, and down into my jaw. My vision swam, the lamplight blurring into an indistinct halo. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, knuckles white, trying to anchor myself to something real, something solid, something that wouldn't dissolve into the horrific unreality that was now my existence. But the table felt like dust, like it too was on the verge of crumbling into nothingness, an illusion barely holding its form. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was a living, breathing predator, and I was caught in its maw. Now! I scrambled away from the table, knocking over the precarious stack of journals. They hit the floor with dull thuds, scattering like bones. My legs were unsteady, like a newborn colt's, but I forced myself towards the heavy, iron-banded door. This wasn't the way I'd come in, but it was a door, a chance. It grated, then turned with a groan that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the house. I yanked it open, desperate for the relative familiarity of the main hallway, for any sign of the world I thought I knew. But what greeted me wasn't the hallway. It was a solid, unyielding wall of rough-hewn stone, ancient and moss-dappled, indistinguishable from the exterior of the mansion, as if the room had simply shifted in the space between heartbeats. Or perhaps the hallway itself had vanished, replaced by an impossible barrier, a cruel joke played by a malicious architect. My breath hitched, caught in my throat like a shard of glass. I stumbled back, my mind screaming in protest. This couldn't be real. This wasn't how buildings worked. I tried the other door, the one I'd used to enter this cursed prison library, the one that had let me in just hours, or was it days ago. It was now jammed, the heavy latch refusing to budge, no matter how I wrestled with it, how I threw my shoulder against the thick, unforgiving wood. It felt as though the very material had fused, becoming one with the frame. I turned, wild-eyed, searching for a window, any escape. The reinforced panes, which had offered a glimpse of the moonlit wilderness only moments before, were now completely opaque, coated in a thick, black grime that hadn't been there. They reflected nothing but my own terrified, distorted face, a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The house wasn't just holding me, it was changing around me, sealing me in. This wasn't a haunting, it was a siege. I was trapped. Dust rained down from the ceiling, tiny flakes of ancient plaster, settling on my hair, my shoulders, like a shroud. I slid down the wall, my legs giving out, my mind reeling. My breath came in ragged gasps. The walls of the prison library felt like they were slowly contracting, the ceiling lowering, the air growing thinner, heavier. And the cycle was due. I wasn't just in a house, I was in a tomb, and the lid was closing. My neck ached, my eyes burned, and my fingers were stained with the dust of generations. The initial, frantic scramble for an escape route had faded, replaced by a cold, hard knot of determination in my gut. Running was useless. The house wouldn't let me. It was a cage, yes, but also a complex mechanism, and I was its final, crucial gear. I wasn't looking for a way out anymore. I was looking for a manual. My ancestors hadn't just been cursed,
they had been imprisoned here, just like me, tasked with an abominable duty. My eyes scanned for any deviation, any forgotten passage, any hint of a ritual gone wrong or a loophole exploited. I pulled another heavy tome onto the table, its leather binding cracked and flaking, and thumbed through it, ignoring the faint, dry cough that escaped my throat from the disturbed dust. The timbers groaned above, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth rather than from settling wood. I paused, my breath held tight in my chest, listening. Was it just the wind? Or was it her? The melancholic presence I'd sensed since the first day, now coalescing into something more defined, more malevolent, as I delved deeper into its secrets. My gaze fell upon an entry in a particularly thick, leather-bound volume, written in a hand that was surprisingly firm, almost defiant, unlike the usual trembling scrawl. It belonged to an ancestor named Elias, whose later entries were filled with mad ramblings. But this one, from much earlier, was lucid, horrifyingly so. It detailed not an escape, but a binding. A temporary appeasement, a way to delay the full awakening, to buy time, but the cost. The cost was always the sticking point. I traced the words with a grimy finger. Elias had written about the satiation of the earth heart, a grim euphemism for the offering. But he hadn't just spoken of the bloodline. He'd spoken of resonance. And this frequency wasn't found in flesh and bone alone. It lies in the reverberation of loss, Elias had penned, his ink faded but his words still sharp, in the shattered echo of what was. A sacrifice not of body, but of spirit. A sacrifice of spirit? What did that even mean? To willingly give up everything? My memories? My very sense of self? It sounded like a slow, agonizing descent into madness, a self-imposed lobotomy of the soul. But then, a flicker of something else caught my eye, a small, almost imperceptible symbol scrawled in the margin next to the passage. It wasn't a standard alchemical symbol, nor anything I recognized from the other journals. It looked like a stylized, broken circle, with a single, jagged line bisecting it. As my eyes focused on the symbol, a low hum started, vibrating through the very floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't a sound from the house settling. This was deeper, a resonant thrum that seemed to come from directly below me, from the earth itself. The lamp on the table flickered violently, casting my reflection back at me in the grimy window, a pale, wild-eyed stranger. My heart hammered against my ribs, a panicked bird trapped in its cage. The entity knew. It felt my prying, my desperate scramble for knowledge. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant growl that made the teeth in my jaw ache. Dust rained down from the ceiling, tiny motes dancing in the flickering lamplight. It was a warning, a territorial display. I was on the right track, and it didn't like it. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. Elias's entry continued, detailing how this vessel was to be prepared. It wasn't about dying, but about becoming. About stripping away identity until only a shell remained, a perfect conduit for the entity's temporary dormancy. And the key to this preparation lay not in some grand ritual, but in a specific series of self-imposed deprivations, culminating in an act of absolute, conscious severance from the world. A final, deliberate erasure of self. Reveal/discovery, the journal didn't describe a physical offering of a person. Rather the creation of a living anchor, a person who, through a series of psychological and sensory deprivations, would become so utterly devoid of personal will and attachment that their very existence would act as a temporary, living seal on the entity's awakening. This wasn't death, it was something far, far worse. My stomach churned, while rising in my throat. Not just my life, but my soul. To become nothing, to exist as a mere stopper in a cosmic drain. The thought was paralyzing, far more terrifying than any physical threat. Elias had clearly known this. He had written it down. Or, at the very least, to control the process,
to somehow retain a shred of himself? The house, satisfied with its warning, settled back into its watchful stillness.
My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline.
This was it.
This was the horrible truth. The entity didn't want a simple death, it wanted oblivion, crafted with grim precision.
I stared at the closed journal, then around the room at the stacks of forgotten history. My escape plans were dead. I wasn't just a victim anymore. Imperceptible etching on the page, almost a map.
It wasn't a geographical layout, not a blueprint of the estate, but a series of cryptic lines and symbols that, when I finally pieced them together, pointed to a specific, heavy oak panel within the main library.
A panel I dismissed as purely decorative.
My fingers traced the faint, almost invisible seam in the wood. It was late, the house groaning around me, and the air was thick with the dust of centuries. The flickering beam of my borrowed lantern danced across the ornate carvings, revealing a tiny, almost hidden latch. It was cold to the touch, and when I pressed it, a soft click echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. The panel swung inward, not with a creak, but with a heavy, deliberate sigh of displaced air. Beyond it, a narrow, winding staircase descended into absolute blackness. The air that wafted up was colder, stiller, carrying the distinct scent of damp earth and ancient paper, tinged with something metallic and faintly cloying. The passage opened into a single, vast chamber. Heavy, iron-barred windows, not overlooking the grounds, but set into thick, subterranean walls, suggesting it was built deep beneath the estate. The ceiling was low, vaulted, pressing down.
Rows upon rows of shelves, crammed with leather-bound tomes, stretched into the gloom.
A massive, bolted iron door, like something from a medieval fortress, stood opposite the entrance, clearly meant to keep things in, or perhaps, to keep things out. The entity, I realized, was here, its presence thickening the air, making it hard to draw a full breath. The journals were a collection of fragmented accounts, desperate scrawls from my predecessors. They detailed the cycles, the offerings, the increasing strain on their own minds. It strips away the self, layer by agonizing layer, until only a shell remains. This was no simple death. This was something far more insidious. My financial desperation, the weight of the estate, the crushing isolation, all of it seemed to amplify, pressing in on me. You are alone. You are weak. You are already broken. The thoughts weren't my own, yet they resonated with a terrifying familiarity. Then, the visions started. Not like dreams, but vivid, intrusive memories, forced into my mind. He was writing frantically, her quill scratching a desperate rhythm. Her hand paused, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. Her pen dropped. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Just sat there, an empty husk, her spirit, herself, gone. The vision shifted, blurring into another. A man, much older, with a beard streaked with gray. He was pacing, muttering to himself, his clothes disheveled. He clutched his head, then screamed, a silent scream that tore through my own mind. He clawed at his temples, as if trying to rip something out, something that was lodged deep within. Then, his movements slowed. His eyes glazed over. He simply stood there, facing the door, a statue of despair. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. These weren't just stories, these were the horrifying blueprints of my future. The entity didn't kill, it consumed. It didn't just take a life, it took everything that made a life. My body felt heavy, my limbs leaden. I was weakening, physically and psychologically, just as the journals described. The air grew thick, pressing down, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I looked down at my own hands, seeing a subtle tremor, a slight transparency around the edges of my vision. Was it the flickering lamplight, or was I already starting to fade? A final, stark entry, scrawled in a shaky hand that I recognized as the last caretaker's, my great-grandfather. The cycle approaches its end. The house will choose. It has chosen him. He is the last. There is no escape. Only surrender. Or. The rest was a frantic, indecipherable mess of lines and symbols, ending abruptly. He is the last. That meant me. The final focal point. The full weight of my horrifying inheritance crashed down on me. The house wasn't just a prison for the entity, it was a carefully constructed trap for the bloodline, for me. The sacrifice of spirit wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal, terrifying process of annihilation. My time was running out. I was next. The house, the entity, was preparing me, softening me up, stripping away my defenses. I might be trapped, I might be weakening, but I wasn't an empty shell yet. I wouldn't go down without a fight. I stared at the bolted iron door, a new kind of resolve hardening my gaze. I had to find a way out, not just for myself, but to break this cursed cycle, even if it killed me. And I had a sickening feeling it would. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, grating frequency that vibrated behind my eyes, each flicker a tiny blow to my already frayed nerves. I wasn't here by choice, not exactly. Elias's fragmented journals, unearthed from a hidden compartment in the estate's dusty study, had led me here, to this sterile, oppressive archive, hinting at a truth too terrible to contemplate. He'd mentioned the archives of the confined, a place where desperate men left desperate knowledge, a final, futile attempt to warn. My fingers, grimy with dust and cold sweat, traced the brittle pages of Elias's confiscated research. The warden, a burly man with eyes like polished stones, had given me exactly 2 hours, no questions asked, after I'd spun a convoluted tale about obscure historical records for a long-lost relative. He hadn't bothered to hide his suspicion, but the $100 bill I'd slipped him had smoothed the edges of his skepticism. Now, those 2 hours were dwindling, and with them, my last hope. The designated time, the moment the cycle demanded its offering, was less than an hour away. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the very fabric of reality, a tightening pressure around my skull. I kept glancing at the heavy steel door, then at the single, barred window that offered a sliver of the bruised twilight sky. Trapped. Elias's script, once elegant, had become a frantic scrawl in his later entries, smeared with what looked like dried tears or worse. He detailed the entity's nature, its ancient hunger, its cyclical demands. But what I was searching for, what I desperately needed, was the how. How to stop it. How to break free. My eyes darted across a page filled with arcane symbols and Latin phrases, then snagged on a paragraph tucked away in the margin, almost an afterthought. It was a passage Elias had translated from an older text, something he called the lament of the bound. The offering is not of flesh, nor merely of breath. It is the surrender of the self, the willing dissolution of spirit into the great melancholy. The house is but a vessel, a conduit for the absorption. The entity craves not death, but assimilation. To resist is to deny its sustenance, but resistance itself is a burden it seeks to bear. The only true defiance is to assert, with every fiber of one's being, the inviolable singularity of the self, even when faced with the crushing weight of its embrace. For it is not the blood, but the will it seeks to consume. My breath hitched. Assimilation. Not death. The house, the land, even this prison library, filled with the echoes of trapped lives and forgotten dreams, they were all just amplifiers for its reach. The melancholy presence I'd felt wasn't just sadness, it was the cumulative sorrow of all it had consumed. A low groan reverberated through the floorboards, not from the building, but from within me. My stomach lurched. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent like damp earth and ancient iron. The fluorescent hum intensified, then wavered, casting the room in a strobe-like flicker. This was it.
The time had arrived. The pressure in my head became a crushing vice, pushing against my temples, trying to force its way inward. Join us, Cole. Surrender. Let the sorrow take you. It is easier. My hands trembled, but a new resolve hardened my jaw. Elias's words, the ones he'd scratched out in his final, desperate moments, echoed in my mind. Do not yield. Do not become another echo. The entity wanted my will. It wanted me to give up, to let go, to become nothing. But I was Cole. Cynical, broke, stubborn Cole. I wasn't going to be assimilated. I felt a presence behind me, vast and formless, a gaping maw of emptiness. It wasn't physical, it was a psychic assault, a direct probe into the deepest recesses of my mind, searching for weakness, for a point of entry. You are tired. Let go. A vision flashed before my eyes, the decaying estate, its windows like vacant eyes, and then, myself, standing lifelessly within its walls, another empty shell, another whisper in the wind. But Elias had given me a weapon. Not a blade, but an idea. Assert the inviolable singularity of the self. I squeezed my eyes shut, digging my fingernails into my palms. I thought of my own name, Cole. Thought of my life, messy and imperfect, but mine. My memories, my frustrations, even my stupid financial woes, they were all me. I am Cole, I said, my voice gaining strength, cutting through the spectral wailing. I am not yours. The pressure intensified, a searing pain behind my eyes. The voices shrieked, a sound like tearing fabric, like stone grinding on stone. It was trying to break me, to shatter my will, to force the surrender. But I held on, clinging to the stubborn, infuriating, unique essence of Cole. I imagined a wall, thick and unyielding, slamming down between my mind and its grasping tendrils. The prison library itself seemed to vibrate, the shelves rattling, books tumbling to the floor. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, almost tasting of ozone. I stood my ground, arms wrapped around myself, a single, defiant human island against an ocean of ancient despair. I didn't know if I was winning, or if this was merely the prelude to my own assimilation, but I would not yield. Not to the house, not to the land, and certainly not to the vast, hungry entity that craved my very soul. This was my fight, and I would fight it as Cole, until there was nothing left of me to fight with. Here, the air was stale, smelling of old paper, disinfectant, and the faint, metallic tang of institutional cooking that always seemed to cling to the walls. I ran a finger over the spine of a worn copy of a local history book, the rough texture of the binding a small, grounding detail in a world that had long since lost its anchor. It had been. How long? Weeks? Months? The concept of time, once a rigid framework, now felt like a loose, ill-fitting garment. The last thing I remembered clearly was the pressure, the shriek, the tearing sensation behind my eyes as I fought, clinging to the stubborn, infuriating, unique essence of Cole. I had imagined a wall, a barrier, a defiant fist raised against the encroaching darkness. I had pushed back with everything I had, every ounce of rage and fear and desperate will to simply be. Then, a sudden, blinding flash. Not of light, but of pure, white absence, and then, nothing. Waking up had been disorienting. The mansion was gone. Or, rather, I was gone from the mansion. The details were hazy, fragmented. A frantic search party, the bewildered faces of sheriff's deputies, the acrid smell of smoke and damp earth. They had found me, they said, wandering the perimeter of the scorched, collapsed ruins where the house had stood. They asked questions I couldn't answer, or wouldn't. Questions about the fire, about the collapse, about the things I babbled about. The entity. The offering. The cycle. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? To them, I was just a man who had lost his mind,
and possibly his temper, with an old, decaying property.
A financial struggle, they'd theorized. An insurance fraud gone wrong.
My story, when I could even articulate it, was too wild, too impossible.
So, here I was. Confined. Safe, they called it.
I traced the faded lettering on the book's spine again. My eyes flickered to the heavy, barred windows, black mirrors reflecting the library's sparse interior. Just the distant, muffled clangs of the facility and the occasional, shuffling footsteps of a guard on patrol.
The entity. It was still there, I knew. I felt it.
Not as a direct assault anymore, not as the overwhelming psychic scream.
A hum.
A low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate just beneath my skin, a bass note to the fluorescent lights. It was like a phantom limb, an absence that was more present than any presence.
I had fought it. I had pushed it back. But had I won?
Or had I merely
changed the terms?
It was a layered quiet, full of implied sounds. The rustle of turning pages, the creak of an old chair, the almost imperceptible shift of air.
And sometimes, very faintly, I heard them. Not the tormenting shrieks from before, but soft, almost comforting murmurs.
They spoke of history, of lineage, of the deep, enduring roots of the land. They spoke of care.
I was a caretaker, after all. That was my legacy.
I picked up the book, letting it fall open to a random page.
It was a dry account of local timber industries in the early 20th century.
My eyes scanned the text, but my mind was elsewhere. The revelation had come slowly, like a bruise blooming under the skin.
I hadn't defeated it. I had merely redirected it.
Or, perhaps, I had become a conduit. The fight, the resistance, it hadn't been about escaping the sacrifice.
It had been about refining it.
About finding a way to contain the entity without allowing it to fully awaken and consume everything.
My bloodline, my family, they hadn't been sacrifices in the traditional sense.
They had been vessels. Living prisons, each generation holding a piece of the entity at bay, keeping it dormant, feeding it just enough to prevent its full, cataclysmic emergence.
And I, Cole, the last of my line, had simply taken my place in that unending chain. The prison library after hours.
It was a fitting metaphor, I mused, a bitter smile touching my lips.
I was in a prison, yes.
But the true prison was within me. The walls of this institution were nothing compared to the walls I now carried, the subtle, intricate architecture of containment that my ancestors had perfected, and that I had, through sheer, desperate will, rebuilt within myself.
I didn't flinch. I didn't even look up.
He saw a man quietly reading, a model inmate, perhaps a little vacant in the eyes, but harmless. He saw a man who had lost everything. He didn't see the hum that resonated through my bones. He didn't feel the ancient, patient presence that now resided, dormant but ever present, in the deepest chambers of my being.
I was Cole. And I was the prison.
The entity was still there, beneath the scorched earth, beneath the mountains, but now, it was also here.
With me. And I was its caretaker, its warden, its living, breathing cage.
The cycle continued, unbroken. A profound, terrible peace.